You are
Stand
relieved of your
outside.
duties,
You're
effective
blocking
immediately.
real clients.
You can't
The
do
words
this.
didn't
I
echo.
can, and I
They
have.
sliced,
There will be
sharp and
consequences.
deliberate,
They're already happening.
cutting through the polished
You no
stillness
longer
of
have
the marble
control.
lobby like they'd
This
been
can't be
rehearsed
happening.
100 times before. Naomi Carter didn't flinch. Not when the receptionist folded her arms. Not when the glass doors closed just a little tighter behind the couple who had just walked in ahead of her without a single question.
The
Not
records
when a
clearly
man in
show
a
unusual
tailored
activity
navy
under your
suit slowed his
credentials.
steps
understand,
just
CEO,
enough
it's all
to
there.
look her over.
We need to secure the
then
system
kept
immediately
walking
and
like she was
investigate the
part
full
of the
extent of this
decor.
breach.
The
The audit
air
logs
inside
prove
the building
everything.
wasn't quiet
Your access
anymore.
is revoked.
It was
You
charged.
can't just do that. I'll
Naomi
fight this.
stood
It's
just
already done.
outside the entrance
Security
of
will
Whitmore
escort you
Tower.
out.
42 stories of glass
I've reviewed
and
the
steel
numbers,
rising into
and
a
the projections
gray
for next
Manhattan
quarter are
morning.
concerning.
Her reflection faint in the door
I believe
she
I have a
hadn't been
solution,
allowed
sir.
to pass through.
I told you to
She
address
wore a
the
fitted
security
black
breach, not
blazer,
bury it.
dark
This is a
jeans,
misunderstanding.
low
I was
heels,
managing it
nothing
internally.
flashy,
The logs prove
nothing
otherwise.
that screamed power.
You're out.
That was intentional. It
I've
always
reviewed
was.
the proposal.
She
I
adjusted the
believe the new
strap of her
approach
leather
offers a
bag
significant
slightly on her
advantage.
shoulder.
Agreed.
Her movements
Let's move
calm,
forward immediately.
precise, like
The
someone
system
who had
clearly
already
shows
seen this
unauthorized
scene
access
play out
under your
before.
credentials.
Because she had.
I
Before we
can
continue,
explain.
where are you
There's no
watching
mistaking
from?
these logs.
Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Carter. Inside the lobby, the receptionist, blonde, late 30s, name tag reading Claire,
I trust
leaned
you are
toward her
all ready
coworker
for this new
and
chapter.
whispered something that made
We're ready,
them both
ma'am.
glance
We're ready.
toward the door again. Naomi could see it through the glass. The quick look, the subtle shake of the head, the decision already made without a single question asked. I said wait outside. Claire repeated, louder this time, pushing the door open just enough to let her voice carry. If you have business here, someone will come get you. Someone will come get you. Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the words. The phrasing, the assumption built into it. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for a manager. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped back half an inch, giving the door exactly what it wanted, space. Behind Claire, the lobby stretched out in quiet luxury. Polished floors, soft lighting, a reception desk that curved like a statement piece rather than a workstation. People moved through it with purpose, badges clipped, phones pressed. To ears, conversations about numbers and meetings and schedules. No one stopped. Not really. But a few slowed just enough to notice. A young man near the elevators glanced over, then again, then lingered. A woman in a gray coat paused mid-step, eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the scene. Naomi caught every single one of those looks. She always did. Not because she was searching for validation, but because she understood something most people in that lobby didn't. Moments like this weren't small. They were systems revealing themselves in real time. A gust of wind brushed past as another group approached the entrance. 3 people, all white, all dressed in variations of business casual. Claire smiled before the door even opened. Good morning, she said warmly, stepping aside. No hesitation. No verification. They walked in. Naomi remained outside. The door closed again. And just like that, the contrast was complete. The kind you didn't need to explain. The kind that explained itself. A phone lifted from somewhere to Naomi's left. She didn't turn immediately, but she registered it. The slight shift in posture, the angle of the device, the quiet murmur that followed. This doesn't feel right, a voice said under its breath. Naomi exhaled slowly. Not frustration, not defeat, just control. She had learned that early. Control wasn't about what you said. It was about what you didn't react to. Her mind flickered, not away from the moment, but deeper into it. Years ago, different building, different city, same glass doors, same tone. She was 24, standing outside a consulting firm in Chicago, resume in hand. Heels that hurt just enough to remind her she didn't fully belong in them yet. The receptionist had looked at her the same way. Not rude, not loud, just certain. We'll call you if we need you. They never did. Naomi blinked once, and the memory dissolved. Not gone, just placed exactly where it belonged. Behind her. Fuel, not weight. Back in the present, Claire checked her watch, then looked at Naomi again with a kind of practiced patience. The kind that wasn't really patience at all. Ma'am, she said, opening the door halfway again. I can't let you in without authorization. You're going to need to wait. Authorization. Naomi's eyes lifted slightly, meeting Claire's for the first time. Not confrontational. Just direct. Check your system, Naomi said quietly. No edge. No emotion. Just clarity. Claire blinked, caught off guard for half a second. Then the expression returned. That same subtle tightening around the mouth. "We already did," she replied. "There's nothing under your name." Naomi nodded once, as if confirming something only she could see. Inside, the young man by the elevators shifted his weight, clearly listening now. Another phone lifted. The energy in the lobby was beginning to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to feel. Enough to matter. Naomi reached into her bag, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate. She pulled out her phone. The screen lit up, reflecting faintly against the glass door between her and the space she'd just been denied. For a moment, she didn't dial. She simply looked at it. Then, with a single, precise tap, she brought it to her ear. "It's starting," she said. Her voice was low, steady, unmistakably in control. A pause. Then, initiate protocol black. Lock internal access logs. Full audit. On the other end, there was no confusion. No hesitation. "Confirmed," a voice replied. Naomi lowered the phone slightly, her gaze returning to the lobby. To Claire. To the people who were now watching a little more openly than before. She didn't smile. She didn't shift her stance. She just stood there, exactly where they had told her to stand. Outside. And for the first time since she arrived, the building didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like something about to open. The moment the call ended, nothing seemed to happen, and yet everything had already begun to shift because power did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moved quietly beneath the surface like a current you could not see, but could suddenly feel. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been told to stand, just outside the glass doors. Her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, but her presence now carried something different, something heavier, something that made the air around her feel charged in a way that was impossible to ignore. Inside the lobby, Claire glanced back toward her screen, tapping twice, then frowning slightly, as if something had not responded the way it should have. She tried again, her fingers moving faster, now the confidence in her posture beginning to crack, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Beside her, the second receptionist leaned in, whispering, "What is it?" And Claire shook her head quickly. "System lag, probably." But her voice did not carry the same certainty it had a minute ago. Near the elevators, the young man who had been watching earlier shifted closer, not enough to draw attention to himself, but enough to hear, better enough to see the small details that were starting to stack up one by one. Naomi watched all of it, not like someone waiting, but like someone observing a process she had already set in motion. Her phone remained in her hand, the screen dark. Now her reflection faint. Against it, she did not check it. She did not need to. Across the lobby, a soft chime sounded from one of the terminals, then another, then a third, subtle at first, but noticeable, the kind of sound that belonged to systems updating, or more accurately, systems being interrupted. Claire's screen flickered once. She blinked, leaned forward, and tapped again. Nothing. The cursor froze for half a second, then the entire interface refreshed, clearing itself before returning with a login prompt that had not been there seconds ago. She stared at it, confused. "That is weird," she muttered under her breath. The second receptionist straightened slightly. "What happened?" Claire swallowed. "It logged me out." She typed her credentials, quickly pressing enter. The system paused, then rejected them. "Incorrect password." Appeared in clean, impersonal text. She tried again, slower this time, more deliberate. Same result. A faint crease formed between her brows. "Now, did you change something?" she asked her coworker, who shook her head immediately. "No, I have not touched anything." Another chime echoed from deeper inside the building, followed by a low murmur, voices beginning to rise, not loudly, but enough to signal disruption. A man in a gray suit near the security desk pulled out his badge, swiped it across the reader, and paused when the light blinked red. He tried again, same result. "That is not right," he said, half to himself, half to the guard standing nearby. The guard took a step closer, scanning his own access panel, which now displayed a similar message: "System unavailable. Please contact administrator." The words sat there, calm and final, like a locked door with no handle. Naomi's gaze moved slowly across the lobby, taking in each reaction, each small fracture, in what had been a seamless environment seconds ago. She did not smile. She did not react outwardly. But there was a shift in her eyes, a quiet recognition that the process had moved from initiation to impact. Outside the building, a black SUV pulled up to the curb, not with urgency, but with purpose, the kind of arrival that did not need to rush, because it was always expected, even when people did not realize it. Yet the driver stepped out first, scanning the entrance briefly before opening the rear door. A woman in her early 40s, stepped out dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her movements precise. Her expression focused. She did not look around. She looked directly at the doors, then at Naomi, then back at the doors, as if confirming something she already knew inside. Claire stepped back from her station, now her voice rising slightly. Okay, something is wrong with the system. The second receptionist nodded quickly. I cannot log in either. Their manager had not arrived yet, but the absence of control was already spreading like a ripple through water. The young man near the elevators took another step closer, now fully engaged. Is everything okay? He asked, not out of concern for the system, but for what he had just witnessed outside. Claire forced a tight smile. Just a technical issue. We will have it resolved shortly. But even as she said it, another employee approached from the hallway behind them, his expression tense. The access doors on the 23rd floor are locked. People cannot get into their offices, he said, and this time there was no way to hide it. The problem was no longer contained. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, one small movement, but it carried intention. She glanced toward the approaching woman from the SUV, who was now walking toward the entrance with calm, controlled steps. The distance between them closed quickly, not rushed, just inevitable. The woman stopped just short of the door, meeting Naomi's eyes for a brief moment of silent confirmation. Then she reached for the handle and opened it without hesitation, stepping inside the lobby as if the space had always belonged to her, because in a way it had. She did not look at Claire first. She looked at the room, at the screens, at the employees now moving with uncertainty, then finally at Claire, who straightened instinctively. Ma'am, we are currently experiencing a system issue. If you could please wait, Claire began, but the woman raised a hand slightly, not dismissive, just enough to pause the sentence. I am aware, she said, her voice calm, measured, and unmistakably authoritative. She turned her head slightly toward Naomi, still standing outside, and for the first time Claire followed her gaze fully, really looking this time, not just seeing a person outside the door, but seeing the center of whatever was happening in front of her. The woman inside spoke again, not loudly, but with clarity that carried through the entire lobby. You asked her to wait outside. It was not a question. Claire hesitated just long enough for the answer to reveal itself in her silence. Yes, because she is not authorized, Claire replied, the words coming out more defensive than confident now. The woman nodded once, as if noting it mentally. And you checked the system? Claire nodded quickly. Of course I did. There is no record. The woman's expression did not change, but something in her posture settled into place, like a final piece of a puzzle locking in. That is because the system you checked is no longer the system that matters, she said simply, and then she turned fully toward the door again, stepping aside just enough to clear the path between Naomi and the entrance. The glass barrier that had separated inside from outside suddenly felt less like a boundary and more like a mistake waiting to be corrected. Naomi did not rush. She did not step forward immediately. She took one breath, then another, and then she moved her hand, reaching for the door handle that had been denied to her minutes ago. And this time, there was no one stopping her, no voice telling her to wait, no hand raising a barrier. The door opened smoothly, quietly, almost effortlessly, as if it had never been meant to stay closed at all. And when Naomi Carter stepped into the lobby, the entire room seemed to recalibrate around her, not because she demanded it, but because something deeper had already been set in motion and was now impossible to ignore. Claire's eyes widened just slightly, the first real crack in her composure, as she took in the shift, the presence, the undeniable change in the atmosphere. Naomi stopped just inside the threshold, not advancing, not retreating, just standing there exactly where she chose to be. And for the first time since this began, she spoke again, her voice calm, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. Run the system again, she said, and this time it was not a suggestion, it was a test that had already been decided. Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard for half a second too long, and that hesitation said more than any answer she could have given, because confidence does not pause like that. Confidence moves quickly without checking itself twice. But this was different now. The room felt different. The system felt different, and most of all, the woman standing in front of her felt different. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not step closer. She did not need to. The instruction had already landed. Run the system again. Claire swallowed lightly, then nodded almost automatically, like her body had responded before her mind could catch up. Okay, she said, her voice thinner, now less certain. She turned back to the screen, entering her credentials again, slower this time, more careful like. Precision could somehow fix what had already changed. She pressed enter. The system paused longer than before, a quiet second stretching just enough to make the entire lobby feel like it was holding its breath. Then the screen shifted, not to the standard interface she expected, but to something else, something she had never seen before. A clean black overlay with white text appeared, centered, an unignorable executive override access granted. Claire blinked once, then twice, her hands frozen above the keyboard. What is that? The second receptionist whispered beside her, but Claire did not answer because she could not. The system continued loading, lines of information cascading down the screen, not chaotic, not broken, but structured, deliberate, every movement controlled, like it had been designed to reveal exactly what it was revealing, and nothing more. Naomi watched it all, without moving, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but her presence now filled the space in a way that made it impossible for anyone in the lobby to look away. The young man near the elevators took another step forward, now openly watching, no longer pretending to be uninvolved. Is that part of your system? He asked quietly, and this time Claire did not even attempt to answer, because the answer was already in front of everyone. Her access, her control, her certainty had been replaced by something else entirely, something she did not recognize and could not manage. Across the lobby, another terminal lit up with the same interface, then another and another, until it was clear this was not isolated, this was not a glitch, this was a takeover of something deeper, something foundational. The security guard near the badge reader tapped his panel again, then looked up confused. All access is locked on my end too, he said, and his voice carried just enough to reach the growing circle of attention around the front desk. The woman who had entered from the SUV stepped slightly to the side, now positioning herself just behind Naomi, not as protection, but as alignment, as confirmation of authority rather than challenge. Claire's eyes flickered between the screen and Naomi, then back again, trying to reconcile the two images in front of her, the woman she had dismissed minutes ago, and the system now responding in a way that only one kind of person could trigger. I do not understand, Claire said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, and Naomi's response came just as calmly, just as precisely. You were not supposed to. The words did not carry anger, they did not need to, they carried something else, something colder, something more final. Understanding. Claire's shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight of that realization had finally settled in around them. The lobby was no longer moving the same way. People who had been walking were now standing, people who had been talking were now quiet, phones were still raised, but no longer discreetly, now openly documenting something that felt like it mattered beyond this moment, beyond this building. Naomi took one step forward, not toward Claire, but toward the space itself, claiming it without announcement. Her heels made a soft sound against the polished floor, a small detail, but in the silence it echoed like a shift in authority. Scroll down, Naomi said, and Claire obeyed without question, her fingers moving again, this time not in control, but in response. The screen revealed a series of logs, time-stamped entries, precise and undeniable records of access, decisions, overrides, and denials, each one tagged with user identification, and each one more revealing than the last. Claire's breath caught slightly as she recognized her own name appearing again and again next to entries marked restricted access, denied, manual, override, rejected. Pattern recognition does not take long when the pattern is clear, and this one was unmistakable. The second receptionist leaned closer, her voice shaking just enough to reveal what she was thinking without saying it. That is from today, she said, and Claire nodded slowly because she could not deny it. The timestamps were fresh, recent, undeniable. Naomi's gaze did not leave the screen as she spoke again. Keep going. And the command carried no urgency because it did not need it. Time was no longer something she was chasing, it was something she was controlling. The logs continued expanding, not just today, not just this morning, but days, weeks, months, each entry forming a line, each line forming a pattern, each pattern forming a truth that had been invisible until it was not. Across the lobby, the man in the gray suit who had been denied access earlier stepped closer, now his earlier frustration replaced by something else, curiosity, recognition, understanding. This is an audit, he said quietly, and the woman beside him nodded slowly. Not just an audit, she replied, an exposure. Claire's hands trembled slightly, now not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that she felt it, enough that she knew she had lost something she could not immediately get back. Control. Naomi finally turned her head slightly, looking at Claire fully, now not with hostility, not with triumph, but with clarity, the kind that leaves no room for misinterpretation. You said there was nothing under my name, Naomi said. And Claire opened her mouth to respond, but the words did not come because the truth was no longer something she could shape. It was something she had to face. Naomi continued, her voice steady even. That was the moment this became necessary. A quiet silence followed, not empty, not passive, but full of realization, the kind that shifts a room from one state to another. Without warning, the woman from the SUV stepped forward slightly, now addressing the space as much as the individuals within it. All management-level access has been temporarily suspended pending review. She said, her tone clear, official, controlled. Please remain where you are while the system completes its verification process. Her words carried authority, but they did not create the moment. They simply confirmed what had already begun. Claire stepped back from the desk, instinctively, her role, her position, her certainty, all feeling less defined than they had minutes ago. Who are you? She asked, finally, the question breaking through everything else. And for the first time, Naomi answered directly, not with volume, not with performance, but with truth delivered exactly as it was meant to be heard. The person you asked to wait outside, Naomi said then, after a brief pause, just long enough for the meaning to settle. And the person who decides who belongs inside. The words landed, and the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because once truth is spoken in the right moment, it does not need to be repeated, it does not need to be explained, it simply exists, and everything around it adjusts accordingly. The screens continued to update, the logs continued to reveal, and the space that had once excluded Naomi Carter now responded to her presence, as if it had always been hers all along. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt precise, like something had been measured and placed exactly where it belonged. Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, without shifting her posture, without claiming attention, yet somehow holding all of it. The screens continued to glow around the lobby, each one displaying fragments of a truth that no longer needed interpretation. Timestamps, user IDs, decision logs, each line a quiet record of choices that had once gone unnoticed. Claire stared at the screen in front of her, but she was no longer reading it. She was seeing herself inside it, her name repeating in a pattern she had never stopped to question until now. The second receptionist took a small step back, her arms folding instinctively, as if distance could soften what was unfolding, but distance did not change clarity, and clarity was everywhere. Now the young man near the elevators let out a slow breath. This is real, he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear, and that was the moment the room fully shifted from confusion to understanding. Not everyone understood the system, not everyone understood the access logs, but everyone understood what it meant when power revealed itself this way, not with noise, not with anger, but with control. Naomi took another step forward, her movement smooth, deliberate, the kind of movement that did not interrupt the moment, but defined it. She reached the edge of the reception desk, not as a visitor, not as someone asking permission, but as someone reclaiming a position that had never actually been taken from her, only challenged for a moment. Open the escalation file, she said, and Claire hesitated again, not out of defiance, but because hesitation had become her only remaining reflex. I do not have access to that, Claire admitted, her voice low and uncertain, and Naomi nodded slightly, as if expecting that answer. That is correct, she said, then turned her head slightly toward the woman who had arrived from the SUV. Grant her temporary view only access, she added, and the woman responded immediately, without question. Access granted, she said, tapping once on a tablet in her hand. Within seconds, Claire's screen updated again, a new panel sliding into place labeled Internal Escalation Records. The title alone changed the air in the room, because escalation meant something had already gone beyond normal procedure. It meant attention had already been drawn somewhere it should not have been. Claire scrolled slowly, now each movement careful, each line heavier than the last. Complaints filed not by name, but by category, flagged interactions, unresolved reports, each one tied to patterns that were no longer invisible. A date from 3 weeks ago, another from 2 months before that, then another going back further, each one small on its own, each one easy to dismiss in isolation, but together they formed something undeniable, a system within the system, one that had been operating quietly beneath policy, beneath training, beneath everything that was supposed to prevent exactly this. Naomi watched the screen, not as someone discovering something new, but as someone confirming what she had already suspected. Her eyes moved once across the entries, then back to Claire. Do you see it? She asked, and Claire nodded slowly, her throat tightening slightly. Yes, she said barely above a whisper. Say it. Naomi replied, not raising her voice, not pressing, just requiring clarity. Claire swallowed, then spoke again, this time louder enough for the room to hear. It is a pattern, she said, and the words settled into the space like a final piece locking into place. Naomi gave a small nod, not approval, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Patterns are not accidents, she said. They are decisions repeated until they feel normal. The second receptionist looked away, now unable to hold Naomi's gaze because the words did not just describe the system, they described her participation in it. Across the lobby, the security guard stepped back from his station, his earlier authority replaced by uncertainty, as he watched the same system that supported his role now move beyond his control. The man in the gray suit folded his arms slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more reflective, something more personal, as if the moment had reached beyond the building and into experiences he had never fully named before. Naomi turned slightly, addressing the room without raising her voice. This building runs on systems, she said. Access systems, security systems, operational systems. She paused just long enough for the structure of that statement to settle. But the most important system is the one you do not see. Her gaze moved briefly across the employees, then back to Claire. The one that decides who gets questioned and who gets welcomed. No one interrupted, no one disagreed, because the evidence was no longer theoretical, it was visible, measurable, undeniable. The woman from the SUV stepped forward again, her tone shifting into formal clarity. All current management personnel have been flagged for review, effective immediately, she said. Until that review is complete, decision-making authority is suspended. Her words did not create panic, they created stillness, the kind that follows when people realize the structure they relied on is no longer stable. Claire stepped back another half step, now her hands lowering to her sides, as if letting go of something she had been holding without realizing it. I was just doing my job. She said the sentence coming out almost automatically, the kind of defense that had been used so many times it no longer felt like a choice. Naomi looked at her directly, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with something far more difficult to stand in front of: understanding. No, Naomi said quietly. You were deciding who deserved access to it. The distinction landed harder than any accusation because it removed the shield of policy, it placed responsibility back where it belonged. Claire's eyes dropped to the floor, then back to the screen, then back to Naomi, as if searching for something that would restore the version of reality she had been operating in minutes ago, but that version was gone, replaced by something clearer, something less comfortable. Naomi reached out then, not to take control of the system, but to steady the moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk, a small gesture, but one that anchored everything around it. This is not about one moment, she said. It is about every moment that looked like this one and went unchallenged. Her voice remained even, measured, but the weight behind it expanded, filling the room in a way that made silence feel like the only appropriate response. The young man near the elevators lowered his phone slightly now, not because the moment was less important, but because it had become something he did not want to interrupt, something he wanted to witness fully. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the woman beside her. Prepare the management list, she said, and the response came instantly, already compiling. The tablet in the woman's hand reflected lines of names, positions, timestamps, each one tied to the system, now exposed, each one part of a structure that had just been pulled into the light. Claire's screen updated again, this time displaying a list of names she recognized immediately, her own, included, not at the top, not at the bottom, but within a group that now carried a single label: under review. The words did not shout, they did not accuse, but they changed everything. Naomi looked at the screen, then back at Claire one final time in this moment. You asked me to wait outside, she said calmly. Now you are going to stay exactly where you are. She paused just long enough for the meaning to settle completely, while we decide what happens next. And for the first time since this began, Claire did not respond, not because she refused, but because she understood the shift had already happened. The decision was no longer hers to make. The room did not return to normal, because normal no longer existed, not in the way it had 10 minutes ago, not in the way Claire understood it, not in the way anyone standing in that lobby could pretend it still did. Naomi Carter stood steady at the front desk, her presence now fully integrated into the space, not as an interruption, but as the new center of gravity, and around her the building continued to respond, screens updating, systems recalibrating, access points shifting from automatic trust to deliberate control. The woman With the tablet stepped slightly closer, her eyes scanning the data as it continued to compile. Management hierarchy is now fully mapped, she said, her tone calm but precise. Primary decision makers have been identified across all active floors. Naomi nodded once. Projected, she said, and within seconds the largest screen behind the reception desk flickered, then expanded into a structured display, names, roles, timestamps, each entry connected by thin lines forming a network, not random, not scattered, but organized in a way that revealed exactly how decisions had flowed through the building, who approved what, who denied what, who escalated, and who ignored. The pattern was no longer just visible, it was undeniable. The second receptionist let out a slow breath, her arms dropping to her sides completely now, as if even the idea of holding tension had become pointless. I did not know it was like this, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, and Naomi's response came without turning toward her. That is how systems like this survive, she said. They do not need everyone to know, they just need enough people to follow. The words settled into the room, not harsh, not loud, but heavy in a way that made silence feel like agreement. Across the lobby, a door opened sharply from the back hallway, and a man stepped out quickly, mid-50s, tailored suit, posture rigid, the kind of presence that usually commanded attention without asking for it. But today it did not arrive the same way. Today it entered a room that had already shifted beyond his control. His eyes moved immediately to the reception desk, then to the screens, then finally to Naomi. What is going on here? He asked, his voice firm, but edged with something new, something uncertain. The woman with the tablet glanced at him briefly, then back to Naomi, waiting not for instruction, but for confirmation. Naomi turned slowly, now facing him fully. You must be Ryan Whitmore, she said, and the way she said his name did not carry respect or disrespect. It carried recognition, the kind that meant she already knew more than he expected. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. I am the general manager of this building, he replied, stepping forward just enough to reassert his role, or attempt to, and I would like an explanation for why my systems are being overridden. Naomi held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, simply steady. They are not your systems anymore, she said calmly, and the words did not echo, they settled. Ryan paused just long enough for the shift to register, but not long enough to accept it. That is not how this works, he said quickly, his tone sharpening as if confidence could be restored through volume. You cannot just walk in here and take control without authorization. Naomi tilted her head slightly, the smallest movement, but one that carried precision. Authorization is exactly what you denied me, she replied, and the clarity in her voice removed any room for argument. Because it was not an opinion, it was a sequence of events. The young man, near the elevators, took another step closer, now no longer observing from a distance. He told her to wait outside. He said to no one in particular, and yet everyone heard it, because the truth did not need direction, it simply needed space. Ryan's eyes flickered briefly toward the voice, then back to Naomi. Who are you? He asked, and this time the question did not carry authority, it carried necessity. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she gestured slightly toward the screen behind her. Look at the pattern first, she said, and Ryan hesitated, then turned just enough to see the display fully, the network of decisions, the repeated entries, the timestamps, aligning in a way that was impossible to dismiss. His expression shifted, not dramatically and not visibly to everyone, but enough that someone paying attention would see it, the moment where certainty began to separate from reality. These are operational logs, he said slowly. They do not mean what you think they mean. Naomi stepped forward one more step, now closing the distance, just enough to make the conversation unavoidable, then explain them, she said simply. Ryan opened his mouth, then paused, because explanation requires alignment, and the data in front of him was not aligning with the narrative he had relied on. These are standard procedures, he said finally, but the words lacked weight, lacked grounding, because standard procedures do not create patterns like that, not without intention. Naomi nodded once. That is exactly the problem, she said. They became standard. The silence that followed stretched longer, this time not uncomfortable, but revealing the kind of silence that forces people to sit inside what they would rather move past. The woman with the tablet spoke again. All flagged decisions have now been cross-referenced with complaint records, she said. Correlation rate exceeds 80%. Ryan turned sharply toward her. That is not possible, he said, and she met his gaze evenly. It is already verified. She replied. Naomi watched the exchange without interruption because the system was speaking for her now, the data carrying the weight that words no longer needed to hold. Ryan took a step back, not retreating but recalibrating his hands, adjusting slightly at his sides, as if trying to find a position that still felt like control. This needs to be handled internally, he said, his tone shifting toward negotiation, toward containment. We do not need to escalate this in front of clients. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened slightly. It was already handled internally, she said. That is why we are here. The distinction landed clean, removing the option of quiet resolution, removing the possibility that this could return to a closed-door discussion, because the door had already been opened and the room had already seen what was inside. Across the lobby, more employees had gathered, now drawn not by instruction, but by the shift itself, the sense that something foundational was being rewritten in real time. Naomi turned slightly, addressing the space again, not raising her voice, not commanding attention, but receiving it fully. Every system reflects the people who use it, she said, and every pattern reflects the decisions those people repeat. Her gaze moved briefly across the faces in front of her, then back to Ryan. You did not build a system of access, she continued. You built a system of judgment. Ryan shook his head quickly. That is not accurate, he said, but the response came faster than the thought behind it. And that gap was visible. Now Naomi did not argue, she did not correct, she simply looked at him for a moment longer, then spoke again. It does not need to be accurate to you, she said, it only needs to be true. The words did not escalate the moment they clarified it, and clarity is what removes resistance, not force. The woman with the tablet stepped forward slightly again. Management list is complete, she said, holding the screen toward Naomi. Names filled the display, each one tied to a role, each one connected to the system, now under review. Naomi glanced at it once, then back at Ryan. You are at the top of this list, she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a fact. Ryan's shoulders squared slightly, the instinct to defend still present, but weakening. Then we will review it together, he said, and for a brief second it sounded like leadership, like an attempt to regain footing. Naomi shook her head, once a small, precise movement. No, she said, you will be reviewed, and the difference between those two statements settled into the room like a line drawn that could not be crossed. Back over the screens behind her updated again, the network shifting, highlighting specific entries, narrowing focus, identifying responsibility. The system was no longer just showing patterns, it was assigning them. And in that moment, the building that had once asked Naomi Carter to wait outside was no longer deciding who belonged inside. It was waiting for her to decide who did not. The moment the words settled, the room did not erupt, it tightened, like something invisible had drawn every line a little sharper, every breath a little slower. Because when authority shifts, it does not always announce itself, it reveals itself in who speaks next, and who does not. Ryan Whitmore stood still for a fraction longer than before, and in that fraction something gave, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to point to, but enough that the structure around him no longer held the same weight. His eyes moved again to the screen, then back to Naomi Carter, as if trying to locate the exact moment. Control had changed hands and failing to find it, because it had not been a moment, it had been a process. Naomi did not rush him, she did not press forward, she allowed the silence to do what it was already doing, which was removing every unnecessary layer, until only the truth remained. The woman beside her glanced down at the tablet again, then back up. Full compliance audit is now locked in across all departments, she said. No data can be altered, no records can be deleted. The statement did not raise tension, it finalized it. Ryan let out a slow breath, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty. You are making a mistake, he said, and the words came measured, now not forceful, not defensive, but strategic, the tone of someone trying to redirect a situation that had already moved beyond redirection. Naomi's eyes remained steady. Mistakes are unintentional, she replied. This is documented. The distinction was small but absolute, and it left no space for negotiation. Claire remained near the desk, her presence smaller, now not physically, but contextually, as if the role she had occupied minutes ago no longer existed in the same way. Her eyes stayed on the screen, as if looking away would make the entries disappear, but they did not disappear. They multiplied, more logs surfacing, more connections forming, the system continuing to expose itself. Without hesitation, across the lobby, another employee stepped forward hesitantly, a man in his early 30s, badge clipped slightly crooked, as if he had put it on quickly when the alerts began. I think I should say something. He said, his voice not loud, but clear enough to cut. Through the stillness, Naomi turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without interrupting the flow. Go ahead. She said, the permission simple, but immediate. The man swallowed once, then continued. There have been complaints, he said. Not formal ones at first, just people mentioning things, how they were treated at the front desk, how they were questioned more than others. His eyes flickered briefly toward Claire, then back to Naomi. We were told to follow protocol, but it did not feel like protocol. It felt selective. The word hung there, selective, and once spoken it could not be pulled back because it named what had been happening without needing data to confirm it. The data had already confirmed it. The word simply translated it. Ryan turned sharply toward him. This is not the time for speculation, he said, but the authority behind the statement had thinned noticeably. The man shook his head slightly. It is not speculation, he replied. It is consistent, and consistency is what turns isolated moments into patterns. The room absorbed that quietly. Phone still raised, not for spectacle now, but for record, for evidence, for something that felt like it extended beyond this building, beyond this moment. Naomi listened without interrupting, without reacting outwardly, because what mattered was not the volume of voices, it was the alignment of truth, and that alignment was forming clearly now. Thank you, she said too. The man, and the acknowledgement carried more weight than a longer response would have, because it confirmed his voice had been heard, not dismissed. The woman with the tablet tapped once more, then lifted the screen slightly. We are receiving additional flags from prior quarters, she said. Archived complaints that were marked resolved, but show no follow-up action. Naomi's gaze sharpened slightly at that, not with surprise, but with recognition. Pull them forward, she said, and the screen behind the desk updated again, older entries appearing now layered beneath the recent ones, extending the pattern backward in time, revealing that this was not a recent shift, not a new behavior, but a sustained one. Ryan took another step back, now not retreating, but adjusting his position in a room that no longer centered around him. Those were closed cases, he said quickly. They were reviewed and resolved according to company standards. Naomi turned toward him fully again, and this time there was a different weight in her stillness, not heavier, not louder, just more defined. Resolved does not mean corrected, she said, and the sentence landed with quiet precision, because it separated outcome from appearance, something the system had blurred until now. The second receptionist lowered herself into her chair slowly, as if standing had become unnecessary, as if the posture of authority she had mirrored from Claire earlier no longer had a place here. We were told to move quickly, she said, her voice softer than before, to keep the lobby efficient, to avoid delays. Naomi nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding. Efficiency without equity is exclusion, she said. It just looks organized. The words did not accuse, they clarified, and clarity is what changes how people see their own actions. Claire's hands rested on the edge of the desk, now her fingers still, her gaze fixed forward. I thought I was following the rules, she said quietly, and Naomi's response came without hesitation. You were following a pattern, she said. Rules can be corrected, patterns have to be broken. The distinction settled into the space around them, and it shifted something, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the atmosphere felt different, less defensive, more exposed. Across the lobby, the man in the gray suit stepped forward again, his earlier frustration replaced now with something closer to recognition. I have been here 3 times this month, he said. Each time I was asked for additional verification while others walked through without a word. He paused briefly, then added, I did not say anything, because I assumed it was just me. The sentence carried a weight that did not belong to him alone. It belonged to anyone who had experienced something similar and chosen silence, because it felt easier than questioning it. Naomi listened, then gave a small nod. That assumption is part of the system too, she said. It isolates the experience, so it never becomes visible. The room absorbed that in a way that felt different from before, not just observing now, but connecting the moment to something larger, something more familiar. The woman with the tablet spoke again. All access privileges for management are now fully suspended, she said. Temporary oversight has been reassigned. Naomi did not look at the screen. She already knew what it would show. She had already set it in motion. Good, she said simply, then turned back to Ryan. This is the part where you usually take control of the room, she said, her tone even not confrontational, just direct. But today you are part of what the room is looking at. Ryan did not respond immediately because there was no response that could restore the version of authority he had relied on minutes ago. The structure that supported it had already shifted. The system that reinforced it had already been removed. Naomi took one final step forward, now fully occupying the space in front of the desk, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as the center of decision. "We are not here to argue about what this is," she said. "We are here to decide what happens next." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the room had already aligned around it. The screens continued to display the data, the logs, the patterns, but now they felt less like evidence and more like confirmation of something everyone present had already begun to understand, and in that understanding, the building that once defined who belonged inside was no longer defining anything at all. It was waiting, and for the first time, every person in that lobby knew exactly who it was waiting for. The room did not need another announcement, because the moment had already crossed into something irreversible, and everyone in that lobby could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. Naomi Carter stood at the center of that shift, not elevated, not exaggerated, just exact, like a point. Everything else had begun to align around her. Gaze moved once across the faces in front of her. Claire, the second receptionist, the security guard, the man who had spoken, the woman beside her, Ryan Whitmore, and then back to the screens, because the screens were still speaking. And they had not finished yet. The data continued to populate now. More refined, more focused, the system narrowing its lens from pattern to responsibility, from observation to consequence. The woman with the tablet glanced down again, then up, her voice steady. "We have identified direct override activity tied to management-level decisions," she said, "specific entries where standard protocol was bypassed." She turned the screen slightly toward Naomi. "Authorization codes linked to Ryan Whitmore." The room did not react loudly. It did not need to, because the name carried through it on its own. Ryan's posture tightened, not in aggression, not in defense, but in awareness, the kind that comes when something you assumed was invisible becomes the only thing people can see. "That does not prove intent," he said quickly, his voice controlled, but thinner now, less anchored. Naomi did not look at him immediately. She let the statement sit in the air long enough for its shape to reveal itself before responding. "Intent is not what is being measured," she said calmly. "Impact is." The distinction landed clean, removing the argument before it could fully form, because intent can be debated, but impact is recorded, and the records were already in front of them. Claire's eyes lifted from the screen toward Ryan for the first time since he arrived, not with expectation, not with alignment, but with something else, something closer to distance, as if the connection between their roles had shifted without either of them choosing it. The second receptionist looked between them, then back at the data, her earlier uncertainty now replaced by quiet recognition. "You approve these," she said softly, not accusing, just stating what the screen had already made clear. Ryan did not answer immediately, because the system had answered for him. The timestamps, the authorization codes, the sequence of decisions, all aligned in a way that did not require interpretation. The man in the gray suit spoke again, this time louder than before. "So this was not random," he said, and his voice carried across the space, because it no longer belonged to a single perspective. It belonged to the pattern itself. Naomi turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the statement without interrupting its weight. "Random does not repeat like that," she said, then her gaze returned to Ryan. "And it does not get signed off at the top." The woman with the tablet tapped once more, then lifted her screen. "Again, there is more," she said. "Internal communication logs have been cross-referenced with flagged entries." Naomi nodded. "Show it." And the large screen behind the desk shifted again, the clean structure of the data, now layered with excerpts, short lines of internal messages, time stamped attached to decisions. Phrases that once felt routine now carried different meaning. "Prioritize verified clients. Limit access during peak hours. Use discretion when necessary." The words were neutral on their own, but context had changed them. Context had exposed what discretion had been used for and who it had been used on. Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering, just slightly, not in surrender, but in recalibration. "Those are operational guidelines," he said. "They are not instructions for discrimination." Naomi's eyes remained steady. "Guidelines become instructions when they are applied the same way every time," she replied, and again the system supported her, not emotionally, not rhetorically, but factually. The entries lined up, the decisions aligned, the outcomes repeated across the lobby. The employee who had spoken earlier shifted his weight, then added quietly, "We all knew what discretion meant. The sentence did not carry accusation, it carried admission, and admission changes the shape of a room more than any argument. Can Claire looked down again, her hands now resting flat against the desk, as if grounding herself in something physical, while everything else shifted around her. I thought I was being efficient, she said, and Naomi's response came without hesitation. Efficiency that excludes is not efficiency, she said. It is selection. The word landed differently than the others because it named the action directly, without softening it, without framing it as anything else. The second receptionist nodded slowly, as if the word had connected something she had not been able to articulate before. Selection. She repeated quietly, and once spoken it could not be unspoken because it fit too precisely. The woman with the tablet stepped closer again. We have reached threshold, she said. Audit criteria for immediate action has been met. Naomi did not ask what that meant. She already knew. She had set the threshold. She had defined the criteria. She had allowed the system to reach this exact point. Proceed, she said, and the word did not escalate the moment it finalized it. The screens updated again, the network collapsing into a list, the list collapsing into a smaller set of names. The system moving from broad exposure to direct accountability. Each name now highlighted, each role now defined. Ryan Whitmore at the top, followed by department heads, supervisors, decision makers, all connected, all visible, all part of something that was no longer hidden. Ryan looked at the screen, then back at Naomi, and for the first time since he entered the room, there was no attempt to redirect, no attempt to control the narrative, only recognition of where it had already gone. What exactly are you doing? He asked, and the question no longer carried authority, it carried the need to understand. Naomi stepped forward one final step, now fully closing the space between them, not confrontational, not aggressive, just present in a way that made avoidance impossible. I am finishing what you started, she said quietly. The words did not accuse, they clarified. You built a system that decided who belongs, she continued. Now I am deciding who stays. The difference between those two statements settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything around it. The man in the gray suit lowered his arms, now no longer guarded, no longer skeptical, just watching as something he had experienced quietly was now being addressed openly. The employee who had spoken earlier stood straighter, not because he had gained authority, but because the space had changed enough for truth to stand without consequence. The woman with the tablet tapped once more, then looked at Naomi. All relevant parties are now flagged for removal of access privileges, she said. Naomi nodded once. Do it, she replied, and the command did not echo. It executed across the system. Access points, updating badges, deactivating permissions, dissolving, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The security panel near the entrance flickered once, then stabilized under new parameters. The terminals reset under restricted control. The building itself responding to the shift in authority without resistance, because systems do not argue, they follow. And now they were following her. Claire's screen displayed the final update, her name still there, still visible, still under review, but no longer in control of anything. She looked at Naomi, not with fear, not with anger, but with understanding, the kind that comes too late to change the moment, but early enough to learn from it. Naomi held her gaze for a second, then turned slightly, addressing the room. One last time in this phase, this is not about punishment, she said. It is about correction. Her voice remained calm, measured, grounded. What you allowed to repeat ends here. The words did not need emphasis, they carried their own finality. And in that moment, the building that once operated on quiet decisions, invisible patterns, and unchecked discretion was no longer operating the same way at all. It was no longer deciding who to question, who to allow, who to delay. It was recalibrating under a different standard, one that had just been made visible, one that had just been enforced, and one that no one in that room would forget, because they had seen exactly how quickly everything can change when the person you asked to wait outside is the one who owns the door. For a moment after the system executed the change, nothing moved, not because people were frozen, but because the room had shifted into something deeper than reaction. It had shifted into realization. Naomi Carter stood still at the center of that realization, her presence no longer something that needed to be asserted. It had already been established. The screens behind her now steady, no longer cascading, no longer revealing, but holding the final state of what had been uncovered access, revoked privileges, suspended oversight, reassigned, each line a quiet confirmation that the system had not just been exposed, it had been corrected. Ryan Whitmore looked at the display. Longer this time, not searching for error, not searching for reversal, but absorbing the permanence of it, his name still at the top, no longer tied to authority, but tied to accountability. And that distinction changed everything around him. Claire remained at the desk, her hands no longer gripping the edge, her posture no longer braced for control. Instead, she stood in a space where her role had been redefined. In real time, and there was no training for that, no script for that, only the clarity of what had just happened. The second receptionist glanced at her, then back at Naomi, as if waiting for something else to follow, something louder, something final. But Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to, because the room was already listening. The woman with the tablet stepped forward again, her tone measured. All management access has been fully disabled, she said. Temporary leadership protocols are now active across all departments. Naomi nodded once. Assign interim oversight to compliance, she said, and the response came immediately, already in place. Across the lobby, a subtle shift occurred. Employees who had been standing uncertain began to reposition, not out of confusion, but out of structure. The building was adjusting, not collapsing, and that difference mattered. The security guard stepped away from his original post, then back again, checking the updated panel, now operating under new authorization. His movements slower, more deliberate, as if he understood that the system he followed now required a different kind of attention. The man in the gray suit lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up at Naomi, not with curiosity now, but with respect, the kind that forms when someone witnesses a system change, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. So this is it, he said quietly, and Naomi turned slightly toward him. This is the beginning, she replied, and the distinction carried weight because endings close things, but beginnings change them. The employee who had spoken earlier shifted closer again, this time not hesitant, not unsure, but grounded. What happens to everyone who was affected, he asked, and the question did not feel like a challenge, it felt like a continuation. Naomi's answer came without delay. They are contacted directly, she said. Every flagged interaction, every unresolved complaint, every recorded instance, we follow up, we acknowledge, and we correct. Her voice remained calm, but the structure behind it was unmistakable. No automated responses, no general statements, direct accountability. The woman with the tablet nodded slightly, confirming. Outreach protocol is already being prepared, she said. Claire looked at Naomi again, her expression no longer defensive, no longer confused, just open in a way that had not been present before. And us? She asked quietly, the word carrying more than the question itself. Naomi met her gaze fully. You stay where you are for now, she said. You observe, you learn, and you wait for review. Claire nodded slowly, not because she agreed, not because she approved, but because she understood that the process was no longer something she could influence, only something she could move through. Ryan exhaled again, this time longer, the tension in his shoulders easing, not from relief, but from recognition, the kind that comes when resistance is no longer useful. You planned this, he said, and it was not an accusation, it was an acknowledgement. Naomi tilted her head slightly. I prepared for it, she replied. The plan came from what you built. The words did not attack, they reflected, and reflection is harder to argue with than accusation. Ryan gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if the clarity of that statement had settled somewhere deeper than the conversation around him. Across the lobby, more employees had gathered, not crowding, not intruding, but present in a way that suggested the moment belonged to them as much as it did to Naomi. The building was no longer operating as a collection of separate roles. It was responding as a single system, recalibrating itself in real time. Naomi took a slow step forward, then another, not toward any one person, but into the space itself, her movement subtle, but defining. This building does not change because I walked in, she said. It changes because the system inside it is being corrected. Her gaze moved across the room, then back to the screen. And that correction does not stop here. The woman with the tablet tapped once more, then looked up. Company-wide audit can be initiated within the hour, she said. Naomi nodded. Do it, she replied, and the command carried beyond the room, beyond the lobby, beyond the building itself, because the system they had just corrected was not isolated. It was part of something larger, something that had been operating quietly in more than one place for more than one moment. The second receptionist straightened slightly now, her posture shifting not back to what it had been, but into something new, something more aware. Will this happen everywhere? She asked, and Naomi's answer came, without hesitation, everywhere it needs to. She said the certainty in her voice did not come from assumption, it came from decision, and decision is what changes systems, not intention, not policy, not appearance. Across the lobby, the man who had been denied access earlier looked toward the entrance. The same doors that had closed in front of Naomi minutes ago now open, without question, as another group walked in. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. There was no pause, no hesitation, no silent evaluation, just movement, and that movement carried something new, something more equal, something more consistent. Naomi followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at the room. Access is not about who looks like they belong, she said. It is about whether they do. The words settled into the space, not as a lesson, not as a speech, but as a standard, the kind that does not need to be repeated once it is understood. The woman with the tablet stepped beside her again. Final confirmation is complete, she said. All changes are locked in. Naomi gave a small nod, then turned one last time to face the room fully. This is what accountability looks like, she said. Not later, not behind closed doors, not explained away in reports, but here in real time, where the impact happened. Her voice remained even, grounded, steady. You do not fix a system by ignoring the moment it fails. You fix it by stopping it where it stands. The room did not respond with applause. It did not need to, because the response was already there, in the way people stood, in the way they looked at each other, in the way the building itself now moved under a different standard. Ryan Whitmore lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, not toward Naomi, but toward the screen, where his name remained no longer at the top of authority, but at the center of consequence. And in that shift, something else became clear, something that no longer needed to be said out loud. The system had changed, the structure had shifted, and the person who had been told to wait outside had not just walked in, she had redefined what inside meant for everyone. The building did not return to routine, because routine had been replaced by awareness, and awareness does not disappear. Once it has been seen, it lingers, in the way people stand, in the way they move, in the way they look at each other, as if something invisible has been made visible and cannot be unseen. Naomi Carter remained near the front desk, but the space around her no longer felt like a checkpoint. It felt like a command center, not because she had claimed it loudly, but because the system itself had aligned to her presence. The screens held steady, the logs now archived into structured records, the access grid stabilized under new permissions, everything quieter now, but not the same quiet as before. This was not ignorance, this was clarity. The woman with the tablet stepped slightly to Naomi's side again, her posture unchanged, her tone consistent. Company-wide audit has been initiated, she said. All regional systems are now syncing under compliance review. Naomi gave a small nod, not surprised, not reactive, simply confirming the continuation of what had already begun. Good, she said. No exceptions, no delays. The words carried not urgency, but expectation, the kind that defines outcomes rather than requests them. Across the lobby, a subtle shift continued. Employees who had once followed instinct now paused before acting, as if recalibrating their own decision-making in real time. The security guard glanced at each person approaching the entrance, not to judge, not to filter, but to ensure the system applied equally. His movements slower, more deliberate, his role no longer defined by assumption, but by structure. The man in the gray suit approached the desk again, this time not as an observer, but as someone stepping into a space that now felt open to him. I have been coming here for years, he said quietly, and I never realized how much I adjusted myself just to avoid being questioned. He paused briefly, then added, until today. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady. Adjustment is what systems like that depend on, she said. It keeps the pattern invisible, because everyone thinks the problem is personal. The man nodded slowly, the understanding settling into him in a way that did not need further explanation. Nearby, the employee who had spoken earlier stood a little straighter, his voice carrying more confidence now, not because he had gained authority, but because the environment had shifted enough to support truth. If this is happening here, it is happening in other places too, he said. Naomi turned slightly toward him. That is why we are not stopping here, she replied. We are not fixing a moment, we are correcting a system. The woman with the tablet tapped once more, then lifted her screen. Initial responses from other locations are already coming in, she said. Some managers are requesting clarification, others are attempting to delay compliance. Naomi's expression did not change. There is nothing to clarify, she said, and nothing to delay. Her tone remained calm, but the message was final: full alignment or full removal. The words did not escalate the room, they defined the boundary. Claire remained at her station, her hands now resting lightly on the desk, her posture no longer defensive, no longer rigid. She watched the exchange between Naomi and the others, as if seeing her role from a distance for the first time. "I never thought about who I was making comfortable," she said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular. Naomi's response came without judgment. "Comfort is not the goal," she said. "Consistency is." Claire nodded slowly, the distinction landing deeper than any correction could have. The second receptionist glanced toward the entrance again, watching as another group walked in. No hesitation, no selective pause, just movement, the same standard applied without adjustment. "It looks different already," she said, and Naomi followed her gaze briefly, then looked back. "It is not supposed to look different," she said. "It is supposed to be the same for everyone." The sentence carried a clarity that reshaped the way the moment was being understood, not as improvement, not as correction, but as alignment. Ryan Whitmore remained near the edge of the desk, his presence still visible, but no longer central. He looked at the screens again, then at the employees around him, then finally at Naomi. "You are dismantling everything that has been in place for years," he said, and his voice no longer carried resistance, it carried observation. Naomi met his gaze directly. "I am removing what should not have been in place at all," she replied. "The rest will hold if it was built correctly." The distinction separated structure from behavior, and in doing so it revealed what had been hidden behind policy for so long. The woman with the tablet spoke again. "Legal and compliance teams are now documenting this as a live intervention case," she said. "All actions are being recorded for internal and external review." Naomi nodded once. "Make it transparent," she said. "No internal summaries, no filtered reports, the full record." The instruction carried beyond the room because transparency is not a reaction, it is a standard, and once said it cannot be selectively applied. Across the lobby, the man in the gray suit exhaled slowly, his earlier tension replaced by something steadier. "I did not expect to see this happen in real time," he said. Naomi's answer came without pause. "That is why it matters," she said. "Accountability loses its impact when it is delayed." The employee beside him nodded slightly. "Most people never get to see the system change, they just hear about it later," he added. Naomi gave a small nod. "And by then it is easier to question it, to doubt it, to minimize it," she said. "But when you see it, you understand exactly what changed and why." The room absorbed that quietly, the weight of witnessing something not often visible, not often addressed, not often corrected. This directly. The woman with the tablet stepped closer one final time. "All changes are now mirrored across connected systems," she said. "This location is fully aligned with the new standard." Naomi took a slow breath, then released it, not out of relief, but out of completion of this phase of the process. She looked around the lobby, once more, not scanning, not evaluating, just observing the space as it now existed. "This is where most people stop," she said. "They fix what is visible and move on." Her gaze returned to the screen, then to the people in front of her. "We do not stop here." The words carried forward not as a warning, but as a direction. "We follow through until the pattern cannot repeat." Claire looked up at that, her expression clearer, now more grounded. "And if it tries to?" she asked. Naomi's answer came immediately. "Then it gets corrected again," she said, faster each time. The simplicity of the response carried more weight than complexity could have, because systems are not changed once they are maintained consistently. The second receptionist nodded slowly. "That means everyone has to be aware, not just management," she said. Naomi gave a small nod. "Everyone is part of the system," she replied, "which means everyone is responsible for how it functions." Across the lobby, the doors opened again. Another group entered, and this time no one paused, no one hesitated, no one adjusted their behavior based on anything other than the standard that had just been set. The difference was not dramatic, it was consistent, and consistency is what defines change. Not moments, not announcements, not statements, but repeated action. The woman with the tablet lowered her screen slightly. "We are ready for the next phase whenever you are," she said. Naomi looked at her, then back at the room, then finally at the entrance. The same doors that had once been a barrier, now simply part of the space, no longer defining who could pass, but responding to how the system was set. "We are already in it," she said quietly, and the truth of that statement settled into the building in a way that did not need to be explained, because everyone there had just seen exactly how a system changes, not over time, not in theory, but in one moment where someone refused to accept what had been treated as normal. and in doing so made normal something entirely different. The lobby no longer felt like a place where people simply passed through. It felt like a place where something had been rewritten, and everyone inside it could sense that shift, not in a dramatic way, not in a loud way, but in the kind of quiet that follows clarity. Naomi Carter stood where she had been standing, but the meaning of that position had changed completely. She was no longer the person being evaluated, she was the one defining the evaluation itself, and the system around her continued to reflect that change. With every passing second, the screens remained stable, the data no longer expanding but holding its structure like a completed equation. The woman with the tablet stepped slightly forward, her voice steady. "Regional confirmations are coming in one by one," she said. "Multiple locations have already begun internal reviews without resistance." Naomi nodded once. "And the ones that are resisting?" she asked. The woman glanced down briefly, then back up. "They are being flagged for immediate intervention," she said. Naomi's expression remained calm. "Good," she replied. "Resistance usually means the pattern is deeper." The words did not carry judgment, they carried understanding, the kind that comes from having seen this before. Across the lobby, a new presence entered, not hurried, not uncertain, but intentional. A man in his late 40s, well-dressed, composed, accompanied by two individuals carrying tablets and folders. His posture was different from the others, not because he held authority, but because he understood it. The moment he stepped into the space, he did not look at the reception desk first, he looked at Naomi, and that alone shifted the attention in the room again. "Ms. Carter," he said clearly as he approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "I am Daniel Reeves from Corporate Compliance. We received the escalation notice." Naomi met his gaze with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. "You are right on time," she said. Daniel gave a small nod, then glanced briefly at the screens behind her, at the logs, at the names, at the structure that had already been laid out. "It appears you have already completed the primary phase," he said. Naomi did not turn to look at the screens. She did not need to. "I started it," she said. "You are here to finish it." The clarity of that statement settled immediately. Daniel nodded again, this time more firmly. "Understood," he said, and then he turned slightly toward his team. "Begin full documentation and verification, cross-reference all flagged entries with compliance standards, and prepare immediate action recommendations." His team moved without hesitation, their devices already active, their roles clearly defined. The presence of corporate compliance did not disrupt the room, it reinforced it, because it confirmed that what had happened here was not isolated, it was recognized, it was validated. Ryan Whitmore watched the exchange closely, his earlier resistance now replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, as if he was beginning to see the full scope of what had unfolded, not just in this building, but beyond it. Daniel turned toward him next. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone professional, neutral, "you have been identified as a primary decision-maker in the current audit findings." Ryan nodded once slowly. "I have seen the data," he said. Daniel held his gaze. "Then you understand the next steps." Ryan did not respond immediately, but his silence was answer enough. Daniel turned back to Naomi. "Would you like to proceed with immediate action or full review first?" he asked, and the question carried weight, because it acknowledged her authority, not just in this moment, but in the process itself. Naomi took a brief pause, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. "Immediate action," she said. "The system has already confirmed the pattern. We do not delay correction when the pattern is clear." Daniel nodded once, agreed, he said, then turned slightly, signaling his team. "Proceed with access termination protocols for all flag management personnel effective immediately." The words did not echo, they executed across the system, quietly, efficiently, completely. The screens updated again, not dramatically, but definitively, each name, shifting status, access revoked, role suspended, review pending. Ryan's name changed first, followed by the others in sequence. Claire watched the update happen in real time, her breath catching slightly, not from shock, but from the finality of it. The second receptionist leaned forward just enough to see the screen more clearly. "It is happening now," she said softly. Naomi did not look at the screen. She already knew what it would show because she had already made the decision. Daniel stepped back, slightly, giving the space back to Naomi, as if recognizing that while he was executing the process, she was defining it. Across the lobby, the employees who had gathered remained present, but their posture had changed again, not uncertain, not reactive, but attentive, as if they were witnessing something that would shape how they moved going forward. Naomi turned slowly, facing the room once more. "This is what accountability looks like when it is not delayed," she said, her voice steady, clear. Not weeks later, not after reports, not behind closed doors, but here where the decisions were made, the words carried through the space, not as a speech, but as a standard. The man in the gray suit nodded slightly, his earlier tension now fully replaced by understanding. This should not be rare, he said. Naomi's response came immediately. It will not be. She said, the certainty in her voice did not come from optimism. It came from control, from structure, from the system that was now aligned to enforce it. The employee who had spoken earlier looked toward Daniel, then back to Naomi. What happens after today? He asked, and the question carried forward into the next phase. Naomi answered without hesitation. After today, the system does not return to what it was, she said. It moves forward with what it has become. Daniel added quietly, continuous monitoring will be implemented across all locations, he said. Patterns will be flagged before they repeat, not after. Naomi gave a small nod. Prevention is more powerful than correction, she said, but correction is where it starts. Claire looked at Naomi again, her expression clearer than it had been at any point before. I understand now, she said quietly. Naomi met her gaze. Understanding is the first step, she replied. What you do with it is what matters next. The second receptionist nodded slowly. We will not let it go back to what it was, she said, and this time the statement did not sound like a reaction. It sounded like a commitment. Across the lobby, the doors opened again. Another group entered the building, moving through the space without interruption, without hesitation, without being measured against anything other than the standard that now applied to everyone equally. Naomi watched them for a brief moment, then turned back to the room. That is what this was about, she said, not the moment at the door, but what the door represents. Her gaze moved once across the faces in front of her, then settled again. Access is not a privilege decided by perception, it is a standard defined by principle. The words settled into the space not as a conclusion, but as a foundation. Daniel stepped slightly forward again. All immediate actions have been completed, he said. The system is now fully aligned with compliance standards. Naomi gave a final nod, then looked around the lobby one more time. The same space that had asked her to wait outside, now operating under a different reality, one that she had not forced, but revealed, one that had always been possible, but had not been applied until now. And in that moment it became clear that this was not just a correction of behavior, it was a reset of expectation, a shift in what was accepted, what was allowed, what was repeated, and what was no longer tolerated. And as the building continued to move under that new standard, one truth remained steady and unshaken. The system had changed because she had refused to adjust to it, and instead made it adjust to her. The room did not disperse when the actions were completed, because completion in that moment did not feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold. Something had shifted too deeply for people to simply return to routine, and so they stayed, not frozen, not uncertain, but present in a way that carried awareness. Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but the weight of what had just happened now settled across the space in a different way, not as tension, but as recognition. Daniel Reeves lowered his tablet slightly after confirming the final updates, his team continuing to document quietly in the background. The system, now stable, not because it had returned to normal, but because a new normal had been established, one that no longer depended on discretion hidden behind policy, but on standards made visible in real time. Ryan Whitmore remained where he stood, no longer attempting to reposition himself within the moment, no longer searching for language that could reframe what had already been defined. His gaze moved across the lobby, taking in the employees, the guests, the screens, the doors, everything that had once responded to his authority, now operating without it. And in that realization, there was no dramatic collapse, no outward reaction, only a quiet understanding that the structure he had relied on had not disappeared. It had been replaced. Claire stepped back from the desk, slowly, not retreating, but adjusting to a role that no longer included control, her hands resting at her sides, her shoulders no longer held in that tight posture of decision making. She looked at Naomi again, not as someone above her, not as someone below her, but as someone she now understood differently. I keep thinking about the moment at the door, she said softly, her voice steady but reflective. It felt small when it happened. Naomi's gaze met hers immediately. It always does, she replied. That is how patterns survive. They look like moments until someone connects them. The words settled into Claire in a way that did not require further explanation, because she had just seen what those connections looked like. When they were finally revealed, the second receptionist leaned lightly against the counter, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a kind of clarity that had not been there before. I Used to think fairness was about treating people politely, she said. But this is different. Naomi nodded once. Politeness can still exclude, she said. Fairness removes the need to question who belongs in the first place. The distinction reshaped the way the moment was being understood, not as an issue of behavior, but as an issue of structure. Across the lobby, the man in the gray suit moved a few steps closer, now standing within the space, not as a guest passing through, but as someone witnessing something that had shifted his own perspective. I have seen companies respond to issues like this before, he said, but never like this, never in the moment, never without delay. Naomi listened, then answered simply, delay protects the system, not the people affected by it. The clarity of that statement carried through the room, reinforcing what had already been demonstrated. Daniel stepped slightly forward again, his role now moving from execution to confirmation. All documentation has been secured and verified, he said. This case will be used as a standard reference for future compliance enforcement. Naomi gave a small nod. Then make sure it is complete, she said. Not just the outcome, but the process, how it was identified, how it was addressed, how it was corrected. Daniel nodded in agreement. Transparency will be maintained, he said, and that word transparency did not feel like a promise. It felt like a requirement. The employee who had spoken earlier shifted his stance, then looked toward Naomi. I think people needed to see this happen like this, he said. Not just hear about it later, but actually see it. Naomi's response came without hesitation. Visibility changes behavior faster than policy, she said. When people see what accountability looks like, they understand what is expected of them. The second receptionist nodded slightly. It makes it real, she said, and Naomi gave a small nod in return. It was always real, she said. It just was not always acknowledged. Across the lobby, the doors continued to open and close as people entered and exited the building, but now the movement felt different, not because the doors had changed, but because the meaning behind them had the same. Space that had once paused to evaluate now moved without hesitation, without silent judgment, without invisible filters. The difference was not dramatic, it was consistent, and that consistency was what made it permanent. Ryan finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, not weakened, but grounded in something more reflective. I thought I was maintaining standards, he said. I did not realize I was shaping them. Naomi turned toward him, fully, her expression unchanged. Standards are not neutral when they are applied selectively, she said. They become something else. Ryan nodded slowly, the understanding settling in a way that did not require defense, because there was nothing left to defend. The system had already spoken for him. Claire glanced at Ryan, then back at Naomi, her voice softer but clearer. If no one had challenged it, it would have continued, she said. Naomi met her gaze. That is what systems do, she replied. They continue until something interrupts them. The word interrupt carried weight because it defined what had happened here, not a disruption, not a reaction, but a deliberate interruption of something that had been allowed to repeat. The woman with the tablet stepped forward one last time. All departments are now operating under interim compliance oversight, she said. Permanent leadership restructuring will begin within 24 hours. Naomi nodded once. Good, she said. Make sure the next structure does not allow this one to rebuild itself. The instruction carried beyond the moment into the future, into the way decisions would be made going forward, into the way systems would be designed, not just corrected, but prevented from failing in the same way. Again, the man in the gray suit looked around the lobby, once more, then back at Naomi. Most people would have walked away after being told to wait outside, he said. Naomi's response came without pause. That is why the system expected it, she said. It was designed to rely on silence. The words landed with quiet force because they revealed not just what had happened, but why it had been allowed to happen for so long. The employee beside him nodded slowly. But you did not stay silent, he said. Naomi gave a small nod. No, she said simply, and that single word carried more weight than any longer explanation could have, because it represented the moment. Everything had shifted, not when the system responded, not when the data appeared, but when she chose not to accept what had been presented as normal. Daniel looked toward Naomi once more. Is there anything further you would like to initiate at this location, he asked. Naomi took a brief pause, her gaze moving across the room one final time, not scanning, not evaluating, but observing the space as it now existed. Then she spoke. No, she said, the system is aligned now. She paused just long enough for the meaning to settle. Now it needs to be maintained. The distinction was important because correction is an action, but maintenance is a commitment. And without it, systems returned to what they were before. The second receptionist straightened slightly, her posture more grounded than it had been all day. "We will not forget this," she said. Naomi looked at her, then at the others in the room. "That is not the goal," she said. "The goal is that you do not repeat it." The words carried forward not as a warning, but as a standard, and in that moment the building no longer felt like a place where something had gone wrong. It felt like a place where something had been corrected in real time, where a pattern had been interrupted, where a system had been forced to reveal itself and then change. And as people began to move again, not away from the moment, but forward within it, one truth remained clear, steady, and impossible. To ignore the difference between what had been and what now existed was not time. It was the decision of one person to stand still when the system expected her to step aside. And in doing so, she did not just walk through the door, she changed what that door meant for everyone who would come after her. The lobby did not empty quickly, because people were not in a hurry to leave a moment that had just redefined something they had quietly accepted for years. They moved slower now, not because they were unsure, but because they were aware. Naomi Carter remained where she stood, not holding the room, not controlling it, but allowing it to settle into what it had become. The system no longer reacting, no longer exposing, no longer correcting, but holding steady under the new standard. The screens behind her unchanged, the access grid stabilized, the structure now clear and consistent. The woman with the tablet stepped slightly to her side, again her role shifting from execution to continuity. "Follow-up protocols have been activated across all affected entries," she said. "Direct outreach teams are being assigned in real time." Naomi nodded once. "Make sure every response is personal," she said. "No automated replies, no general statements. People need to hear from someone who understands what happened, not someone reading from a script." The instruction carried weight, because correction without acknowledgement does not restore trust, it only resets process. Across the lobby, the man in the gray suit remained near the desk, his earlier distance replaced by presence, his voice steady. "I never expected to see a system respond like this without resistance," he said. Naomi turned slightly toward him. "Systems resist when people inside them resist," she replied. "When people align with the correction, the system follows faster." The distinction was simple but precise, and it reframed the moment not as something imposed, but as something allowed. Claire stood quietly beside the desk, her posture no longer tense, no longer guarded, her gaze moving across the room, then back to Naomi. "I keep replaying what I said at the door," she admitted. "It sounded normal when I said it." Naomi met her eyes without judgment. "That is how it becomes normal," she said. "When it sounds routine, it no longer feels like a decision." Claire nodded slowly, the understanding deeper, now more grounded. "But it was a decision," she said. Naomi gave a small nod. "Every interaction is," she replied. "The system just decides which ones get questioned and which ones do not." The second receptionist leaned forward slightly, her voice clearer than before. "I think that is what changed the most," she said. "Before today, I thought the system made the decisions. Now I see that we did." Naomi's response came immediately. "The system reflects the people who use it," she said. "If the people change, the system changes." The words settled into the room, not as a concept, but as something that had just been demonstrated in front of everyone. Daniel Reeves stepped forward again, his tone steady, but now less procedural, more reflective. "This will be reviewed across all executive levels," he said, "not as an isolated incident, but as a structural case study." Naomi nodded once. "Good," she said. "Make sure the focus stays on the pattern, not just the outcome. The outcome matters, but the pattern is what created it." Daniel gave a small nod in agreement. "We will ensure that," he said. Across the lobby, the doors continued to open and close. The rhythm of the building returning, but not to what it had been before. Now each entry felt unfiltered, each movement uninterrupted, the absence of hesitation more noticeable than the presence of it had ever been. The employee who had spoken earlier stepped closer again, his voice steady. "I used to think change like this needed meetings, approvals, time," he said. Naomi looked at him. "Time does not create change," she replied. "Decision does." The clarity of that statement carried through the space because it explained not just what had happened, but how it had happened. The man in the gray suit nodded slowly. "And most people wait too long to make that decision," he added. Naomi gave a small nod. "Because they are taught to adjust instead of interrupt," she said. "Adjustment keeps the system comfortable, interruption forces it to respond. The word interruption lingered in the air because it defined what had just occurred, not an escalation, not a reaction, but a refusal to continue within a pattern that should not exist. Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering further. I see it now, she said, not just what I did, but how it fit into something bigger. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in recognition. That is where change starts, she said, when the moment connects to the pattern, the second. Receptionist nodded beside her. And when it does, you cannot ignore it anymore, she added. Naomi gave a small nod. Exactly, she said. Once you see it clearly, you either correct it or you become part of it. The statement did not accuse, it clarified, and clarity removes the option of pretending not to know. Daniel glanced at his tablet once more, then back at Naomi. All systems are now fully aligned with compliance standards across this location, he said. Monitoring protocols will remain active indefinitely. Naomi nodded. Good, she said. Standards only work when they are maintained consistently, not just when they are introduced. The distinction was critical because introduction creates awareness, but consistency creates change. Across the lobby, Ryan Whitmore remained near the edge of the space, his posture quieter, now his presence no longer tied to authority, but to reflection. He looked at Naomi, then at the screens, then at the employees around him. I thought leadership meant maintaining order, he said quietly. Naomi turned toward him. Leadership defines what that order looks like, she replied, and what you maintain becomes the standard whether you intended it or not. Ryan nodded slowly, the understanding settling in without resistance, because the system had already confirmed it. Claire looked at Naomi again, her voice steady now. What happens to us after the review? She asked. Naomi answered without hesitation. You will be evaluated based on what you did and what you do next, she said. Accountability is not just about consequence, it is about correction. The words carried forward not as a threat, but as a direction. The employee who had spoken earlier nodded slightly. That makes sense, he said. It is not about removing people, it is about removing the pattern. Naomi gave a small nod. Exactly, she said. People can change, patterns do not unless someone stops them. Across the lobby, the building continued to move under the new standard, not dramatically, not visibly, but consistently. And that consistency was what made the difference permanent. Naomi took one final look around the space, the desk, the doors, the people, the screens, everything that had been part of the moment, everything that had now shifted into something new. This is what a system looks like when it is aligned, she said. Not perfect, not finished, but accountable. Her voice remained calm, steady, grounded. And accountability is not something you announce, it is something you demonstrate repeatedly. The room absorbed that quietly, the weight of it settling not as pressure, but as expectation. Daniel stepped slightly back, his role now complete in this phase, his presence still, but no longer leading the process because the process had already been defined. Naomi turned toward the entrance briefly, the same doors that had once been a barrier, now simply part of a structure that functioned without bias, without pause, without silent judgment. Then she turned back to the room one last time. What happened here today does not end when I leave this space, she said. It continues in every decision made after this moment. Her gaze moved across the faces in front of her. Because systems do not change once they change, every time someone chooses not to repeat what they now understand. The words settled into the room like a foundation, not temporary, not reactive, but steady and clear, and as the building continued to operate under that standard, one truth remained undeniable. The moment she was told to wait outside was never the end of the story, it was the exact point where the system revealed itself, and from that point forward it no longer had the option to remain the same. The lobby no longer held tension, it held something steadier, something quieter, but far more powerful. The kind of stillness that follows not confusion, but clarity. Naomi Carter stood at the center of that clarity, not elevated, not separated, but fully present within the space. She had just transformed the screens behind her, no longer active with alerts or updates, now displayed a stable system, one that reflected decisions already made and standards already enforced. The building itself had settled into a new rhythm, not slower, not faster, just aligned, and that alignment could be felt in every movement. Every interaction, every moment that passed without hesitation. Claire remained near the desk, her posture no longer shaped by authority, but by awareness. Her eyes moved across the lobby, then returned to Naomi one last time. I understand now why it mattered that you did not walk away, she said quietly. Naomi met her gaze without hesitation. It did not matter that I stayed, she replied. It mattered that I did not adjust. The distinction landed with precision because staying can be passive, but refusing to adjust is a decision, and that decision is what interrupts a system. The second receptionist stood beside Claire, her expression thoughtful, grounded. I think that is what I will remember most, she said. Not what happened, but what you did differently. Naomi gave a small nod. Difference is where change starts, she said, but consistency is what makes it last. The words carried forward not as a conclusion, but as a principle, something that would extend beyond this room, beyond this building. Beyond this moment. Daniel Reeves stepped slightly closer again, his presence now less formal, more reflective. This will set a precedent, he said, not just in policy, but in expectation. Naomi nodded once. Then make sure the expectation is clear, she said. This is not an exception, it is the standard. Daniel gave a firm nod in agreement. It will be communicated as such, he said. Across the lobby, the man in the gray suit stood still for a moment longer, then took a slow breath, his earlier tension now completely replaced by something steadier, something resolved. I think people will talk about this, he said. Naomi's response came without pause. They should, she said, not because of what I did, but because of what it revealed. The clarity of that statement shifted the focus away from her and back to the system itself, because the moment was never about a single person, it was about a structure that had finally been made visible. The employee who had spoken earlier looked toward Naomi, then around the room. It feels different now, he said, not just here, but in how I see things. Naomi nodded slightly. That is what happens when something hidden becomes clear, she said. You do not just see the system differently, you see your role in it differently too. The second receptionist glanced toward the entrance again, watching as people moved in and out without interruption, without hesitation. It feels normal now, she said. Naomi's gaze followed hers briefly, then returned. It was always supposed to feel that way, she said. What changed is that it finally does. The distinction settled into the room because normal had not been restored, it had been corrected. Ryan Whitmore stood quietly near the edge of the space, his earlier presence now transformed into something reflective, something internal. He looked at Naomi one last time. I did not think a moment like that could change everything, he said. Naomi met his gaze evenly. It does not change everything, she replied. It reveals what was already there and forces it to be addressed. Ryan nodded slowly, the understanding complete now, not resisted, not argued, simply accepted. Claire took a small step forward, her voice steady. If this had not happened, I would still be making the same decisions without thinking about them, she said. Naomi's response came without hesitation. That is why it had to happen this way, she said. Not later, not privately, but here where the pattern could be seen. The words carried weight because they explained not just the outcome, but the necessity of the process. Daniel glanced down at his tablet once more, then back up. All follow-up protocols are in place, all departments are aligned, and all systems are stable, he said. Naomi gave a final nod. Then the work continues, she replied. Because alignment is not a one-time action, it is a continuous standard. The building around them moved steadily, now not returning to what it had been, but continuing forward within what it had become. Each person inside it now part of a system that had been corrected not just for the moment, but for what came after. Naomi took a slow breath, then released it, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded, but the weight of the moment had shifted from action to meaning. She looked once more at the entrance, the same doors that had once closed in front of her, now simply part of a space that no longer questioned who belonged. Then as she turned back to the room, her voice calm, clear, final. You did not just see a system change today, she said. You saw what happens when someone refuses to become part of what is wrong. The words settled into the space, not as a statement to remember, but as something to carry forward, something that would exist in every decision made after this moment. The man in the gray suit nodded slowly. The employee beside him stood a little straighter. Claire and the second receptionist remained still, but present. Daniel lowered his tablet. Ryan looked down briefly, then back up. And in that quiet alignment, something became undeniable. This was not just a correction, this was a reset of expectation. Naomi Carter did not move immediately. She did not need to. The room had already shifted, the system had already changed, the moment had already done what it needed to do, and when she finally turned and walked toward the doors, there was no hesitation, no pause, no silent evaluation. The doors opened without question, without delay, without condition, just as they should have from the beginning. And as she stepped through them, the building behind her continued to operate not as it had been, but as it now was, a system no longer defined by assumption, no longer guided by unchecked Discretion but aligned to a standard that had been made visible in one moment that refused to be ignored, and in that moment one truth remained clear, steady, and permanent. She did not need to raise her voice, she did not need to prove her power, she only needed to stand in it long enough for the system to reveal itself, and once it did, everything else followed exactly as it should.